Thank you for joining us tonight. Before starting, I would like to say that this event will be recorded and the talk will be disseminated via social media later on. We will have English to Turkish and Turkish to English translation throughout the event. And you can switch to the channel of your language preference by using the globe icon on your Zoom. Please follow the instructions on the chat box if there are any, like if we can post them. If you have any technical questions. As you might know, this is the fourth and last event of Feminist Political Ecology meetings, and it has been a great pleasure to have this meeting space with our readers and brilliant scholars who generously shared their work with us. In these meetings, we talked about green alternatives and their gender implications, care work, and its revalidation in the alternative world imaginaries. And we discussed the historical trajectory of incorporation of gender in environmental analysis. Through these meetings, we learned from our speakers as well as each other. We would like to thank all our speakers and our readers and Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for making these events possible. We would like to give special thanks to Pınar Ecevitoğlu from Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, Beyza Yiğit Tüncü from Feminist Women's Circle, and our translators Müge Atala and Barış Yıldırım. In case some of you have not heard yet, our journal is ready and online, and you can reach it via the link we will post on the chat box again. I would appreciate it if we can post the link for the journal on the chat box. And we already started working on our new issue actually, and hopefully we will have new events in the spring and we'll meet you again soon after this one. I am so happy to introduce Giovanna Di Chiro today, and the title of her talk is Revisiting Social Reproduction and Environmental Justice in a Time of Danger. Giovanna Di Chiro is a professor of environmental studies at Swarthmore College. She teaches courses on environmental justice theory, ecofeminisms, and community sustainability. She's also the coordinator of the Environmental Justice and Community Resilience program at the university. Giovanna has published widely on issues of human rights, feminism, and the politics of care, food security, and environmental and climate justice. For our journal, we translated Giovanna's 2008 article, Living Environmentalisms, Coalition Politics, Social Reproduction, and Environmental Justice. When we were working on the translation of her article, we were so impressed with the way she knitted the connections between reproductive rights and environmental justice by reframing environmental crisis as a social reproduction crisis. The article was expanding our visions around environmental and feminist politics, and the concept of living environmentalisms was incredible in terms of rethinking environmental politics in relation to social justice issues. It beautifully explained the significance of coalition work, but also the meticulous work it requires, yet still underlined the importance of not giving up on it. This was for sure something to really think again, particularly in this difficult period we are going through in terms of the rise of neoliberal fascism around the world. Today, she will be discussing these issues in the context of multiple and intersecting crises we have been going through, such as COVID-19 pandemic, ecological and climate disruption, and global poverty, immiseration, and violence. She will discuss why a critical ecofeminist analysis of the new threats to social reproduction is essential. We will also hear from her environmental justice organizing and collaborations as experiments around mutual aid, collective care, and anti-decolonial organizing to protect everyday life and to envision sustainable futures. Her new book titled, we are looking forward to reading it, World Making from the Ground Up, the Praxis of Environmental Justice, is also coming soon. And Giovanna, I cannot explain how happy we are to have you today with us, and the floor is all yours now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I really want to thank Özlem and Zeynep in particular for inviting me and for translating and publishing my article in the journal Feminist Approaches in Culture and Politics. And I'm really honored to have been invited to be part of this journal issue and this online series on feminist political ecology. I'm also very happy to be here with all of you and to share some of my work, my current work, and some of my ideas about how I see linkages between the feminist concept of social reproduction and movements for environmental justice and sustainability. So obviously I'm going to be speaking in English, so I want to also extend my gratitude to the translators who will perform the valiant labor of interpreting my words. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So in the article that Özlem described and that is published in the journal, and again, it was published in the Stone Age way back in 2008, I was writing about the creative ways that women grassroots activists in the environmental justice movement in the United States were fighting for their survival and the survival of their children and families. And these women activists were fighting, and still are, to stop the onslaught of toxic pollution from things like chemical factories, oil refineries, waste incinerators, and nuclear waste dumps, among many other toxic assaults on their bodies, their health, and their homes. In the article, I gave some examples of grassroots women leaders who are largely poor and low-income women of color, Black, Brown, and Indigenous women, who were building alliances, and they still are, across different social movements. And particularly, they were building connections between environmental movements and women's movements. So these activist alliances exposed how the destructive and intersecting forces of patriarchy and capitalism resulted in the poisoning of their air, water, and lands, and also ended up harming their own reproductive health, the well-being of their communities, and ultimately threatening the possibility of a future. So 15 years since the publication of that article, many things have gotten worse. The everyday survival and possible futures for millions of people and for millions of other species living on the earth are still endangered from the increasing perils of many things, including climate change, the mass extinctions of plants and animals, the rise of authoritarianism and fascism, and widespread violence and war. Although the struggles were then and still are today about survival, I think the inspiration behind many movements and coalition politics today is about the creation of alternative visions about how to live together on the earth. And I think many of today's intersectional movements engage in creating new stories about living and even thriving in the midst of these dangerous times. So again, the many dynamic women-identified grassroots struggles for environmental and climate justice that I wrote about in my article saw themselves as fighting for the survival of their own children and their communities, and ultimately for the survival of everyone's children and communities. So because of this focus on survival, I called their forms of ecofeminist politics living environmentalisms, which became, as Özlem mentioned, the title of my article. So their activism was not about expressing some sort of romanticized love or protection for an abstracted, sublime, untouched nature that was somehow out there, but rather it was about the need to protect and to ensure the conditions necessary to maintain everyday life, which includes, of course, clean air, water, and food. So in other words, I argued that unlike mainstream environmentalism around the world, which focuses on protecting non-human nature from the impacts of economic production, living environmentalisms were fundamentally struggles for the protection of what Marxist feminists have termed social reproduction. So I want to draw on feminist historian Titi Bhattacharya's definition of social reproduction. And she says, the best way to define social reproduction is the various activities and institutions that are required for making life, for maintaining life. I call it life-making activities. Life-making in the most direct sense is giving birth. But in order to maintain that life, we require a host of other activities, such as cleaning, cooking, feeding, washing clothes, caring for elders and children. There are physical, institutional requirements for life-making as well. A decent house to live in, public transport to go to work or shopping, public recreational facilities, green areas and parks, good schools, hospitals. So in this quote, Bhattacharya was speaking in the midst of the pandemic, and she talked about the ways the pandemic exposed who does the care work or the social reproductive labor in our modern capitalist societies. When many people around the world were locked down in their homes to stay safe from COVID, the necessary care work continued, largely through the social reproduction tasks accomplished by the so-called essential workers, the people who grow and harvest our food, stock grocery stores, truck medical supplies, pick up garbage, clean elder care homes, and take care of patients. Most of these activities and most of the jobs in the social reproduction sector, like nursing, food production, cleaning, are dominated by women workers, and therefore are undervalued and underpaid, since social reproduction or care work is not seen as real work in terms of capitalist production. But shouldn't care work or life-making activities, as Bhattacharya puts it, be at the center of our thinking about how we make a living, and not invisible, marginalized, or unpaid? So the women activists in the environmental justice movement who I work with and whose stories I write about have long emphasized that life-making also involves ensuring that you can breathe healthy air and drink clean water, and that the places where you live, work, play, go to school are free from toxic contamination. Social reproduction, again, or the act of accomplishing everyday life into the future, requires a clean environment. So it would seem to me that it would be at the heart of environmentalism and of definitions of sustainability. So in my article, I discussed the concept of sustainability, or the idea of sustainable development that emerged in the early 1990s. The proponents of sustainability declared that it was needed to protect our common future, as they put it. And so I argued sustainability should have been the environmentalist counterpart to the idea of social reproduction. That is, it should have focused on how we can develop life-supporting economies and technologies that ensure the survival into the future of humans and the earth. But it didn't. Sustainability was always about sustaining the dominant system and the social reproduction of the few, the so-called 1%. So as the environmental justice scholars and activists that I've worked with have argued, the dominant concept of sustainability is about sustaining capitalism, now branded as green capitalism. And it does this by promoting a variety of technocratic climate solutions and market-based carbon reduction initiatives that most often allow a polluter to continue polluting as long as they offset their emissions with carbon reduction projects somewhere else in the world. And that somewhere else is usually in indigenous people's lands. So the renowned geographer and abolitionist theorist, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, described this dominant sustainability narrative as, quote, using capitalism to save capitalism from the effects of capitalism. Unsurprisingly, to save capitalism, such sustainability initiatives, which are portrayed as our best solutions, leave in place the unjust systems and relationships that created the problems in the first place. This is not an inspiring story. So for feminist theorists and activists like Bhattacharya and Gilmore, the global capitalist framework or the global capitalist lens is the opposite of life-making. It is a thing-making or profit-making enterprise, and profits are often made at the expense of the life-making or the social reproduction needs of poor communities, and particularly low-income women of color and immigrant women and men. It also threatens the capacity for all other species, all other living things on Earth, to make their own living and to thrive into the future. So for many environmental justice critics, this is a story that needs to be abolished. So I want to spend the remainder of my time discussing how I think the dominant story is being reimagined with new stories of life-making on Earth. And I draw my inspiration from many feminist, indigenous, and environmental justice scholars and activists who argue that we need to focus on life-making, on caregiving, and on valuing the practices of social reproduction, even in times of danger, or actually, especially in these times of danger that the world is facing. So how do we focus on life-making and create new stories to imagine alternative worlds and alternative futures? So as many activists from around the world have been saying, especially as we confront these intersecting crises of these times, we need to imagine different stories, different narratives of sustainable and equitable futures. And for me, this means engaging deeply with the places where we live. Or as the Potawatomi scholar Robin Wall Kimmerer has put it, we need to decolonize or indigenize our relationships to the places where we live and work. And she writes, becoming indigenous to a place is not to appropriate the culture of indigenous people, not to take what is theirs, but to throw off the mindset of the frontier, the mindset that allows people to bury sacred sites under industrial waste, to fill a lake with mercury. Being indigenous to place means to live as if we'll be here for the long haul, to take care of the land as if our lives, both spiritual and material, depended on it. Because becoming indigenous to place also means embracing its story. Because the restoration of the land and healing of our relationships mirror one another. So Kimmerer argues that the process of reimagining new stories or engaging in critical practices of environmental restoration or sustainability requires what she calls restoriation. That is, sustainability requires new stories that are grounded in and committed to life-making and healing of the land and the people. To me, changing the narrative and restoriation are key features of an intersectional ecofeminist approach to building generative power to address climate change and all other social and ecological crises around the world. This means changing the narrative and creating different stories that can imagine a way forward, or a portal, as Arundhati Roy has called it, to possible futures that are imagined, for example, by the activists who are calling for a just transition to possible futures in which everyone's lives are considered essential and become part of the story of repair and regeneration. This concept of restoring the idea of sustainability, of what building a sustainable, equitable, and peaceful future would look like if we took social reproduction seriously, was featured in a film short that came out in 2020 called A Message from the Future, The Years of Repair. It was produced by Naomi Klein and Opal Tometi, among others. So Tometi, who was one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, said this about the film: "The pandemic has reminded us that we are all interconnected. It is clearer than ever before what is essential in our society and whose lives must no longer be treated expendable. This film envisions a way to build a better world out of overlapping crises, one in which no one is sacrificed and everyone is essential." I think that this film is a good example of the practices of restoration. The narrative is told from the standpoint of the future, when some of the worst outcomes of climate change have happened, but people's and workers' movements from around the world have succeeded in putting into place a responsive, care-based economy that has implemented a wide array of social, economic, and environmental policies grounded in the essential work of social reproduction, that is, the work of repair, care, and regeneration. So in the film, repair and care work include, for example, prison abolition, full employment, public health and universal health care, sustainable agriculture, renewable energy systems, and free education. You can see in this still shot from the film that the filmmakers also included in their story of repair and regeneration the essential work, or the life-making work, or the social reproductive labor of non-human species as well, including the photosynthesizers, the plants, or the pollinators, the bees. One of the philosophers and activists who has really influenced me and inspired me is Grace Lee Boggs. And I think that Boggs has created and wrote about the need to imagine or restory different futures where we see each other as interconnected and interdependent. Grace Lee Boggs is the Chinese-American Detroit-based revolutionary who, in her 100-year life, after having participated in virtually every major social and environmental justice movement of the 20th and early 21st centuries, she concluded that social movements are born of critical connections rather than critical mass. So for Boggs, building solid relationships, seeing ourselves as connected to each other, as being interdependent, in fact, seeing each other as kinfolk, is the key to effecting change in the world. Grace lived in Detroit, Michigan for over 75 years, and she argued that we needed to be in a place for a while in order to build kinship relations and understand ourselves as interdependent with the communities and in the places where we live together. She thought that Detroit, as the automaking capital of the world and the original capitalist model of mass production, was a good place to build kin and to envision what we need to do to create a more sustainable and equitable future, because Detroit's scarred landscape, which is marked by deindustrialization, white flight, and environmental damage, represents what she saw as the perfect example of the ruins of capitalism. But how do we envision such futures from the places like the city of Detroit and many others that have been abandoned, impoverished, racially segregated, polluted, and written off? In this image, you can see Grace standing in front of an abandoned auto factory in Detroit. So Boggs was renowned for her commitment to the power of imagination, the need to imagine the world, the future that you want to live in. And she would say that we need to be able to imagine and tell different stories of possible futures, futures that don't end in abandoned communities and desecrated landscapes like the one pictured here. So the visionary work of imagination and creative storytelling was at the core of her revolutionary politics in Detroit. My own teaching, my research, my activism has for many decades been committed to these basic concepts of building critical connections, dwelling in community, and kin-making through building meaningful university and community collaborations. And I'll be focusing on some of the work that I've accomplished in recent years working at Swarthmore College, which is the place where I now live and work, located in southeastern Pennsylvania in the United States, which is in the territory of the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Lenni Lenape people, who have been practicing good relationships with these lands, reclaiming their language and culture, and resisting ongoing colonialism for generations. For close to 4 decades, I've been partnering with activists fighting for environmental justice, including those pictured here in nearby Philadelphia and Chester, Pennsylvania. These are activists who have risen up to resist the long history of environmental racism in this country. That is the history of putting our society's environmental bads, such as waste incinerators, refineries, gas pipelines, in communities of color and indigenous territories. We've also joined together in solidarity with many of these local environmental justice communities in the region who are imagining life beyond the bads and who are creating alternatives. Some of these visionary alternatives reject the extractive and exploitative economic and political systems that have gotten us here in the first place. And instead, they imagine new, sustainable, and equitable community economies that are focusing on things like solar enterprises, urban agriculture, and arts-based community development. So I'm committed to bringing the arts and practices of storytelling and restoration into my teaching, so that my students are able to learn from the people in the local community and worldwide who are changing the story. Many of my courses draw on the field of the environmental humanities, a branch of environmental studies that highlights the important role of storytelling in efforts to envision a different world and to create different possible futures. One of the environmental humanities courses that I teach is called Race, Gender, Class, and the Environment. And in this course, we read the life stories or autobiographies, memoirs, testimonials of environmental activists, scientists, and artists who recount the story of how they came to their life purpose, what motivated them to act on social and environmental injustices, how they responded to challenges in their lives, and how they see their own personal stories connected to larger historical narratives and broader social and environmental issues. One of the core learning objectives of the course is the idea that social change starts with your own story. So we draw on the work of sociologist Marshall Gantz, who argues that the practices of storytelling, or what he calls strategic storytelling or public narrative, are important tools and drivers of social change movements. That is, stories are not just personal. They enable broader understandings of how people resist oppressive systems and institutions. So through reading these life stories, we're able to see how public narratives or public storytelling helps to make visible to a wider audience how people experience struggle and trauma, including the trauma of environmental racism and colonialism, but also how they respond to these challenges through hard-won resilience and with extraordinary creativity. So as you can see, I've listed some of the books that we read in the class, and we did read quite a few books, which was probably a bit excessive. But one of the books that we read is a life narrative by Robin Wall Kimmerer called Braiding Sweetgrass: Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. And in the book, Kimmerer tells the painful story of her family's dispossession of their land and culture by US settler colonialism. And also, as I mentioned earlier, when I quoted from her book, she recounts how she has drawn on her indigenous culture's knowledge about the connection to place and the importance of the non-indigenous world understanding indigenous concepts of kinship and relationality. Kimmerer has expanded on this concept of what it means to practice relationality to place and to community in a recently co-edited volume called Kinship: Belonging in a World of Relations. And one of the ideas that she shared in this volume was how important it is to understand the concept of kinship, not simply as a matter of genetic inheritance or something that's shared with one's biological family, but as a process, an active process. For Kimmerer, kinship must be understood as a dynamic practice or a set of practices that are comprised of lively actions like interconnecting, collaborating, sharing, assembling, joining, conversing, and building. In a chapter in the book, Kimmerer and Melissa Nelson, who's also pictured here, discuss how their indigenous Anishinaabe languages are notable for their verbiness. Unlike English, the English language that relies a lot on the use of nouns, Anishinaabe languages are full of verbs. They talk about this difference in terms of how language influences everyday life. So their language, the Anishinaabe language, their verb-filled language, they say generates action, what they describe as life-making action. Indigenous Anishinaabe communities, they argue, are doers. They're creators, builders, dancers, weavers, fishers, cultivators, peacemakers. So Kimmerer and Nelson explain that these activities are all part of life-making and kin-making in the places where they live. My students and I have been really entranced with this prospect of seeing kinship as a verb, as kinning. As both Kimmerer and Nelson put it, kinning is experiential. Kin-making is always alive and intentional, and it is about becoming kin, not simply about being kin, as in the family that you were born into. They explain, we become kinfolk when we share gifts to help each other out. Kinning means being in reciprocity, sharing gifts that will allow each of us to live and to thrive. So kinship in this sense, Kimmerer writes, is a radical challenge to the status quo, a dangerous conception, because when we feel kinship, when we practice kinship, we belong. It gives the lie to hyper-individuality. Kinship makes us feel part of this collective we, and many of the social and economic institutions in which we are embedded depend on alienation. They depend on isolation. If we are alienated from the living world, she writes, then we can commodify the heck out of it. And most important, as Kimmerer emphasizes, kinning also brings us joy and happiness. And this too can be understood as a radical reclaiming of who we are as humans. So over the years, I've thought a lot about the extent to which these important concepts of kinning and living as if we'll be here for the long haul are concepts that have resonance in my own community-based research and activism. It's not always easy to quantify what the genuine impact of university community engagement looks like, but I do think that what I have learned from working with many environmental justice activists in the different places that I've lived is that kinship building is an important goal. So I want to share a few examples of how I and my students strive to build kin-centric relationships living and working here in southeastern Pennsylvania and the Philadelphia metropolitan region. Central to my own approach to building diverse kin-based campus community collaborations in the fields of environmental justice is what I call a pedagogy of engagement. That is, providing opportunities for my students to learn from community leaders about what it means to be connected to a place for the long haul. One of these collaborations is Serenity Solar, which is a collaborative I co-founded in 2012. Serenity Solar started as a university community collaboration between students and faculty at Swarthmore College and community members from North Philadelphia, with the mission to bring solar technology, sustainable community development, and green jobs training opportunities to local residents in this most impoverished and underserved section of the city of Philadelphia. We spell solar, S-O-U-L-A-R, to challenge the mainstream technocratic narrative of the green economy, and instead to emphasize our commitment to keeping the soul or our connection to the people and to climate justice at the forefront of the solar energy transition. And this includes ensuring that a just transition to a renewable energy future prioritizes those communities who have been historically excluded from the economic prosperity of the city. We also want to keep the soul in solar energy to hold our sustainability initiatives true to a feminist intersectional analysis of racial, gendered, economic, and environmental justice, and to support the community's efforts to address the ongoing problems of poverty, unemployment, gentrification, and environmental racism. So in addition to the larger solar installation projects that you see here, Serenity Solar worked with local food justice organizations on smaller projects, including installing a solar charging pole in the People's Community Garden in the neighborhood in North Philadelphia, which enables community residents to learn about renewable energy and to also charge their cell phones when the next climate change fueled storm knocks out the power. And we also installed panels on the farm shed at the Life Do Grow Farm, which is a community-based urban agriculture organization in the heart of North Philadelphia that teaches people about sustainable agriculture and also provides fresh organic produce for the local residents. Here is Kai Sanders. She's one of the original youth members of Serenity Solar, who has now started her own solar installation company that she calls Solar Tech. She's the first Black woman solar installer and solar business leader in the city, and she's committed to a different story of the green economy. She's committed to teaching youth and bringing women of color and queer folks into the green economy future. Serenity Solar's most recent solarization partnership was with the Village of Arts and Humanities, which is a 35-year-old community organization in North Philadelphia that uses the arts as a medium for community reclamation in this section of the city that has suffered from serious social disinvestment over the years, and now it's experiencing rapid gentrification. In alignment with the organization's goals to build what they call civic power and also what they refer to as the staying power to resist gentrification, last year, Serenity Solar and our partners installed an 11 kilowatt solar array on the roof of the organization's community center. This collaboration has enabled the organization to reduce its energy costs and the overhead costs of upkeep of the building so it can remain or stay in the neighborhood and advance its mission of community regeneration, which includes providing opportunities for local residents to gain skills and leadership in the solar energy transition. In recent years, my students and I have collaborated with Zuline Mayfield, who's pictured here, the longtime leader of the organization Chester Residents Concerned for Quality Living, also known as CIRCLE, which is a 30-year-old grassroots organization, a grassroots environmental justice organization located in the nearby city of Chester, Pennsylvania. Chester is a majority Black and low-income city that houses the United States' largest waste incinerator, and it burns all the trash from the surrounding region, including my university. Zuline and CIRCLE's decades-long struggle against environmental racism, fighting for a healthier community, has taught us about the fierceness that fuels this critical kind of environmental justice, work that is fundamentally, I think, about fighting for the rights for social reproduction. My students and I have been working with Zuline and CIRCLE for several years, and she's always expressed the sentiment that it's important to see ourselves as living in kinship relations with residents of Chester, despite the fact that our life conditions may be miles apart. So in this Instagram post that was done by a student in my class, Zuline says, Chester does not have a Wakanda shield over the city, keeping the pollutants from traveling all over the county. The pollution doesn't just stay in Chester. The rest of the county is also affected by the incinerator. And in this Instagram post from just a few weeks ago, Zulene tells my students, why do we fight? What other choice do we have as people who breathe? She went on to say, you have to have skin in the game. Our polluted air in Chester makes its way over to you in the beautiful arboretum, the beautiful landscape of Swarthmore College. This incinerator and this struggle also affect you. We're all breathing the same air. As part of my community-based learning courses, students support the organization by helping with many activities that are requested by the organization, including community outreach and social media, fundraising, data collection on public health statistics, and leading workshops on environmental justice and gardening for children and youth in Chester. Students are also involved in many other lively kinning activities, such as marching, protesting, testifying, and dying in at local government meetings. As part of one of the major goals of Zulene's and other circle members' kin-making strategy has been to put a lot of effort into building relationships with students and young people in the region, which has resulted in a resurgence of student engagement and the revival of an organization known as C4, Campus Coalition Concerning Chester. This is a student-based coalition that has been in existence for almost 30 years. I've seen more and more students clamoring to join C4 at my university and from other university campuses in the region. And they see themselves as actively being part of a community that cares about what's happening to their neighbors and cares about what's happening at their university. So finally, I think that this kind of kin-centric environmental justice organizing that I've been talking about is an active, embodied approach for building critical connections, to use Grace Lee Boggs' words. And it means seeing your own body, your own life worlds in the picture and in the action. I also think that these kinds of collaborations challenge the culture of individualism that's so ingrained in Western and academic thinking. Zulene has helped me and my students to tangibly understand what it would mean to be actively committed to repairing and building kinship relationships, to be actively engaging in practices of interdependence and collective care. I think that kinning or kin-making is an essential act to ensure social reproduction for all. Kinning is about life-making practices that may help us to survive and thrive as our world faces the dangers to come. Thank you for listening.